If the talks don't work out, the bombing starts. Let that land for a second. Not a leaked memo, not an anonymous source, not a rumor from a back channel. The President of the United States looked into the cameras and told Iran exactly what happens if these negotiations fall apart. And here is the part that makes your head spin. At the exact same moment those words were being spoken, U.S. and Iranian diplomats were still sitting across from each other at a negotiating table, trying to reach a peace deal. Same conflict, same week. A war threat and a peace process running simultaneously. So which one is real? And what happens to the rest of the world if the talks collapse? Stay here, because the next 10 minutes might be the most important 10 minutes of news you consume this week. To understand why this moment is so extraordinary and so dangerous, you need about 90 seconds of context.
For the past several months, the United States and Iran have been engaged in a series of indirect and, more recently, direct negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. These are not casual conversations. These are high-stakes diplomatic talks involving senior officials, technical experts, and the kind of back-channel communications that take years to build. The core of the dispute: Iran has advanced its uranium enrichment program to levels that Western governments say are dangerously close to weapons-grade capability. The U.S. and its allies want that program rolled back, capped, and placed under rigorous international inspection. In exchange, Iran wants relief from the crushing economic sanctions that have been strangling its economy for years. It sounds like a straightforward trade. It is not, because embedded in every line of every proposed agreement are decades of mistrust, broken promises, and the fundamental question of whether either side actually believes the other will follow through. The 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was supposed to resolve this. Then the U.S. walked away from it in 2018. Iran responded by accelerating enrichment, and the two countries have been in an escalating spiral ever since. These current talks represent what many analysts believe is the last realistic window for a diplomatic resolution. If they fail, the alternatives are either a nuclear-armed Iran or a military strike to prevent it. And this week, President Trump made crystal clear which alternative he's prepared to use. Now here's why Trump's statement is so much more significant than just another tough-sounding line. Presidential threats are common in geopolitics. Calculated ambiguity, where a leader suggests military action without explicitly committing to it, is a standard negotiating tool. It keeps adversaries uncertain. It creates leverage. But what Trump did was different. He was not ambiguous. He did not suggest. He stated, and the statement was made publicly, which means it now exists as a political commitment. Walking it back becomes difficult. Ignoring it becomes impossible. Iran's leadership cannot simply pretend they didn't hear it. This could trigger a dangerous dynamic inside Tehran's decision-making apparatus. Experts warn that when a foreign leader makes a public military ultimatum, hardliners in the targeted country gain significant political power. The argument writes itself. You see, they were never going to negotiate in good faith. We told you. They want war. If Iran's hardliners use Trump's statement to seize control of the country's negotiating posture, the talks could collapse not because of the substance of the deal, but because of the politics surrounding it. Sources suggest that Iran's negotiating team, people who have reportedly made genuine progress in recent sessions, is now under enormous internal pressure. Every concession they were prepared to offer now carries a domestic political cost that has just gotten significantly higher. And that's not even the most alarming part, because simultaneously, multiple reports indicate that U.S. military assets in the region have been repositioned in ways that look less like routine operations and more like prepositioning. Carrier strike groups, strategic bombers, expanded basing arrangements with Gulf partners. Experts warn military posturing and live diplomacy make for an extraordinarily combustible combination. One misread signal, One incident in the Strait of Hormuz, one provocation by a proxy force, and the conversation shifts from negotiating table to command center in hours. The gap between talks continue and bombing starts has never felt smaller. Let's be precise about this because precision matters. Trump's statement, delivered publicly in his characteristically direct style, linked the outcome of negotiations explicitly to military action. The message was not, "We reserve the right to consider options." It was a direct conditional. If talks fail, military force follows. For a sitting U.S. president to make that connection this explicitly, while negotiations are actively ongoing, is virtually without precedent in recent American foreign policy. Even at the height of previous Iran crises, administrations maintained a careful separation between the diplomatic track and the military threat, precisely to preserve the diplomatic track's viability. Trump's approach is the opposite. He appears to be using the military threat as active negotiating pressure, a way of telling Iran, the cost of walking away is not just the status quo, it's worse than you can afford. Whether that works depends entirely on how Iran's leadership reads it, and analysts are sharply divided. But that's not all, because what's happening inside the negotiations is, in some ways, more surprising than what's happening outside them. According to sources with knowledge of the talks, negotiators on both sides have made more substantive progress in recent weeks than at any point since the collapse of the JCPOA framework. Technical discussions covering enrichment caps, centrifuge limitations, inspection protocols, and a phased sanctions relief timeline have reportedly moved from opening positions toward something closer to actual negotiating overlap. This is significant. Opening positions in these talks were miles apart. The fact that they've moved at all, in a political environment this charged, suggests that both sides have something they want from this process. What happened next surprised even seasoned diplomatic observers. Iran reportedly agreed in principle to a framework that would require more intrusive inspections than any previous agreement. That is not a small concession for a government that has spent decades treating its nuclear program as a matter of national sovereignty. The question is whether Trump's public ultimatum just made it politically impossible for Iran to follow through on that progress, or whether it actually accelerated it by making the cost of failure undeniably clear. This is where things take a genuinely dangerous turn. U.S. military movements in and around the Persian Gulf over the past several weeks have been significant enough to draw attention from defense analysts worldwide. The movements are consistent with what military planners call options development, getting assets into position so that if a decision to act is made, the operational capability is already in place. This does not mean a strike is imminent, but it does mean the United States has reduced the time between a decision and an action to a very short window. Iran is aware of this. Iranian military commanders are watching U.S. asset movements in real time, and their calculations about what is possible and what is survivable are being updated continuously. Sources suggest Iran has also been quietly reinforcing its own defensive posture, air defense systems, hardening of key facilities, dispersal of assets that would otherwise be concentrated targets. These are not aggressive moves. They are the moves of a country that takes the threat of military action seriously. Both sides are preparing. Both sides say they want a deal. And both sides are positioning as if a deal might not happen. That is not a stable situation. What happened next sent shockwaves through every capital in the region. Israel, which has the most direct security stake in the outcome of Iran's nuclear program, responded to Trump's statement with something unusual: public endorsement combined with private caution. Israeli officials praised the tough stance while simultaneously, according to diplomatic sources, urging Washington to give the talks more time to produce a result. The subtext: Israel wants the military option on the table but is not eager to trigger a regional war that would engulf it regardless of the outcome. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states are watching with a different kind of anxiety. They want Iran's nuclear program constrained. They do not want a war in their backyard that collapses oil infrastructure, floods their territory with instability, and upends the economic diversification plans they've spent a decade building. Russia and China, both of which have relationships with Iran and their own complex dynamics with Washington, have publicly called for restraint and a return to diplomacy. Whether that public posture reflects genuine diplomatic effort or simply a desire to let the U.S. absorb the consequences of a failed policy is a question that different analysts answer differently. And in Tehran, the Iranian public, already exhausted by years of economic hardship, is watching their government navigate a moment that could bring relief or bring catastrophe. They did not choose this crisis, but they will live with its outcome. Let's be very clear about what is actually at risk in this moment, because the gap between a deal and a bombing campaign is not just a policy difference. It is a chasm that swallows entire futures. For global energy markets, a military strike on Iran or Iranian retaliation against Gulf infrastructure would send oil prices into a shock spiral within hours. We are talking 20, 30, 40% increases in energy costs, cascading through every economy on Earth. Countries that are already struggling with inflation, debt, and slow growth would be pushed toward crisis. This is not a regional event. It is a global one. For nuclear proliferation, if Iran is bombed and its nuclear program is not completely destroyed, and military analysts say complete destruction is extraordinarily difficult to achieve, the lesson that every other country draws is simple and terrifying. Get nuclear weapons faster before someone bombs you for trying. A failed strike could accelerate nuclear proliferation globally in ways that make the current Iran crisis look manageable by comparison. For the 88 million people of Iran, wars are not abstractions. They are buildings falling, hospitals going dark, families separated. The people who would bear the cost of a military conflict in Iran, in neighboring countries, in the communities of Iranian diaspora around the world, are not the decision makers. They are the ones who absorb the consequences of decisions made far above their heads. For the credibility of diplomacy itself, if the talks fail, if this last realistic window for a negotiated solution closes, the message that sends to every future conflict, every future negotiation, every future attempt to resolve a nuclear dispute through conversation rather than force is devastating. Some problems, the world will conclude, cannot be solved at the table. And that conclusion, once established, has a way of becoming self-fulfilling. But here is where the story gets genuinely complicated, because not everything is as straightforward as it looks. Consider this. Trump has made dramatic statements about Iran before, multiple times. And yet here we are, with diplomacy still alive, negotiations still continuing, and no military action taken. Some analysts argue that Trump's rhetorical escalation is a feature, not a bug, that it is precisely the threat of force that has brought Iran to the negotiating table at all, and that understanding the difference between Trump's public statements and his actual intentions requires reading the full pattern, not just the most recent headline. Others point to something equally important: Iran's own history of using negotiations as a delay tactic. The concern in some Washington circles is not that the talks will fail explosively, but that they will succeed in a limited way, producing an agreement that looks like progress but leaves enough ambiguity in Iran's nuclear program for the country to continue advancing it quietly. In that reading, the real danger is not a bombing. It is a deal that prevents a bombing but doesn't actually solve the underlying problem. And there is a third uncertainty that sits underneath all of this. We do not know what is being said privately. The public statements, Trump's ultimatum, Iran's official responses, the diplomatic readouts, are managed, calibrated, and shaped for specific audiences. The actual state of the negotiations, the actual distance between the parties, the actual flexibility on each side's core demands, that information exists only in rooms that no journalist has access to. Is a deal close? Is it falling apart? Is the bombing threat real or theater? Honestly, the answer is nobody outside those rooms knows for certain. And that uncertainty, genuine, unresolvable uncertainty about whether the next chapter is a historic agreement or a military conflict, is the reality we are all living in right now. Let's bring it home. President Trump has done something no sitting American president has done quite so directly in recent memory. He has publicly linked the outcome of live diplomatic negotiations to an explicit military threat. If the talks don't work out, the bombing starts. At the same time, U.S. and Iranian negotiators have reportedly made genuine progress, more progress than many thought possible, on the technical substance of a nuclear agreement. The military is postured, the diplomats are talking, the threat is on the table, and the outcome is genuinely unknown. This is the paradox at the heart of the Trump approach to Iran: maximum pressure and maximum engagement running simultaneously, daring the other side to pick one or the other. Iran has to decide whether the threat is real enough to make concessions it has resisted for years. The U.S. has to decide how long the diplomatic track remains viable before pressure must become action. And the rest of the world, the allies, the adversaries, the 88 million Iranians, and the billions of people whose energy costs and security environment will be shaped by this outcome, has to wait. The talks continue. The threat stands. And somewhere in the gap between those two realities, between the negotiating table and the flight line, the future of the Middle East and much of the world's stability is being decided right now. The bombing has not started. The deal has not been signed. The world is holding its breath, and whatever happens next happens soon. Subscribe and hit the notification bell, because this story will move fast, and when it does, you need to be the first to know. Share this with someone who's trying to understand what's really happening between the U.S. and Iran right now. The table is still set, but the clock on the wall is running out.